My dissertation considers how outsiders look to Spain and Spanish food in creating the identity of Spaniards, and ultimately how they say, really, the reason that Spain is so backwards in the 19th century is because it's the food they eat, right? The food they eat is appropriate for them because they're dried and parched people. That's why gazpacho is the perfect Spanish food. It is meant for these peasants who are parched and dried up. Therefore, they are what they eat, and they will never be as good as we are. So I actually gave a talk in Barcelona on this very topic, and I was somewhat mortified that I had to say, so the Spaniards are parched and dried up people to an audience of parched and dried up people. But I then passed out gazpacho to all of them, and they were quite delighted. Here today, I am beyond excited. I can tell you that when I moved to Boston from a little podunk town in Connecticut next to a cow pasture to attend college, I certainly never expected in my wildest dreams to have the pleasure of speaking at the MFA. So I am exceedingly honored, and I'm super excited because it's a topic that I love, which is Spanish food. So thank you very much. When I was originally asked to give this talk, I had proposed the title From One Goya to Another Goya, and that was pleasantly declined. And I understand why. We're at the Museum of Fine Arts, a rather dignified institution of learning, but I had to bring it up somehow. Okay, so here we go. We are off on this. And when I first started thinking about what I wanted to say at this presentation, the very first thing was, well, why do people at an art museum, as tied to an art exhibit, why will they want to talk about food? Why will they want to learn about food or think about food? And it becomes really clear of how many connections can be made between art and food, and how many times art has food in it, and how it becomes so much more meaningful, right? And I'm going to argue that there are 4 different ways. We can look at it as a form of communication, right? Both art and food. Certainly they both represent a certain zeitgeist or spirit of the time where they are teaching values of a particular society or group of people. They are both transformative, both through the process of you go from a blank canvas to a finished product, you go to a set of raw ingredients to a completed dish, and we can say that they are both really tied to the idea of survival. And by this, I also mean on 2 different levels. On the one hand, we can say food is the one thing that all humans need to do to survive, right? We need to eat, right? But I think we can also look at this on a broader idea, which is in order for culture to survive, you need the arts to survive, right? And I think culinary arts certainly suggest that culinary are one of the arts. In fact, one of the famous French chefs of the early 19th century, Carême, thought that food was an aspect of architecture. He thought it was an outpost of architecture and very much an artistic pursuit. Right? And we can do this, we can consider this by looking at these 6 paintings. And on purpose, I tried to pick one theme that shows up consistently, and that is bread. Right? In Spanish, it is pan, right? And if we look at Isidore of Seville, 6th century, in his famous book Etymologies, he says, why is pan called pan? And it's because it is found at every meal, right? So it is universal. It becomes the symbolizer of so many things, right? Here in this 14th century manuscript, we have gathering wheat, and that was based on an earlier 11th century Muslim treatise on maintenance of health, right? And we can look at ideas of time, of the calendar, of the self and the community in the calendar, of when you harvested wheat, when you planted wheat, and all of the steps to preserve it so that you could use it throughout the year, right? If we look at the Velázquez painting, we can start seeing how a society structured around the mealtime. This painting is called Lunch. Who's invited to the table? Who are your companions or your company, right? If we look at Goya, right? Painting in the 19th century becomes the sign of the Industrial Revolution as well as the Agricultural Revolution. This idea when we're moving from the old to the new. And here we see, right, one of my favorites, Richard Ford, 19th century English, what he writes about bread in Spain in the 19th century, right? And at first, he talks about coming across this traditional community, right, where all the members of society are participating in the process of the harvesting of the grain and the making of the bread, right? And he says, you can even hear guitar music wherever you are, right? This really pastoral image, bucolic image, right? And it's enchanting to the stranger. But then he goes on, and in his own words, he says, but the Spaniard, bred and born under unshorn beams, is chilly as an icicle, indifferent as an Arab, positively ashamed. Positively ashamed. He sees only the barbarity, antiquity, and imperfect process. He is sighing for some patent machine made in Birmingham and approved by the Royal Society in Cavendish Square. His bowels yearn for the appliances of civilization by which breadstuffs are more scientifically manipulated and manufactured, minus the poetry, right? So now how you're making your bread signifies where your entire society is along that process of modernization, right? It has implications beyond that. Moving up to Picasso, right? His still life with bread. Early 20th century, we're talking modernism, as I'm guessing all of you know in this room. And what was modernism based on? That changing idea of relativity, of time, and of space. And just think of how transformative all of the aspects are based on time and space when we're looking at bread, right? You begin with those raw ingredients, and hands up if any of you are bakers. Not a few, and you're apparently very shy bakers because the hands only went up this high, but I still saw some of you, right? You know that you end up with this rather sort of magical, glutinous, sticky stuff that becomes then this sort of lovely, smooth as a baby's butt, right? And then bake it in the oven, and while it had rather the same color consistency, it transforms into an entirely different product, right, through the Maillard process. But suddenly you have differences between color, between texture, and certainly a whole new range of smells, of aromas, of tastes that you didn't have before. It is absolutely transformative. Do I have any Catholics in the room? I don't know if you're going to be proud or shy based on the bakers, right? But you know the obvious transformation of bread, right? Transubstantiation, talking about the literal transformation between the bread pre-blessing, post. Before, it is simply a piece of bread. After, it is now the blood and body of Christ, right? That is certainly something spectacular. And it doesn't stop there, that understanding of transformation, right? I'm assuming some of you have heard of Brillat-Savarin, right? This 19th century gastronome. And he has one saying that if you know nothing about Brillat-Savarin, you probably know. And he said, "Show me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are, or who you are," right? And I don't know if this crowd are big watchers of Iron Chef. We're talking the original, right? You guys are purists, I get that, right? And that, in fact, is on the opening screen of that TV show. Show me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are, right? And while Brillat-Savarin is writing this in 1826, the idea is not new, right? Because when those early Spanish explorers arrived in the New World, I find this fascinating, I hope you guys do too, right? They looked at the natives, and it's appropriate we're talking about this just at the end of, do you all know what Movember is? Movember, when you stop shaving? I'm talking men. Ladies, you can continue, right? You grow your beard, right? The Spanish looked at the natives and said, they don't have beards. That's what makes you a man. Why aren't these people having beards? Because they have weak semen. Yep. Why do they have weak semen? They're not eating bread. They're not eating wheat. They're eating corn. Therefore, if we're going to live here in this new place, one of the most important things we need to do, start growing wheat so we can keep our masculinity and not become one of those, quote, toasted Indians, right? So, transformative. I don't even know how to top that one, but here we go. All right, looking at Dali, right? Famous bread of 1945. And bread is a typical or common ingredient revisited by our friend Dali. And here he makes note that this was a particular timely work of art finished a day before World War II ended, right? And it's not just bread, basket of bread, but it's also the idea of honor before shame, right? Honor before, or death before shame, right? And he speaks to the moral hunger of the Germans once they leave religion behind and turn to Nazism. And he also uses bread to represent, right, Hitler and his choice to commit suicide rather than to acquiesce to the Allied forces. And finally, we get to food itself. And this is a photograph from the catalog from 2003 by probably the most world-renowned of Spanish chefs, Ferran Adrià, and he calls it bread and pine nut scarf, right? And even that name became really fascinating to me of why a scarf. Why is that symbolically important? And I see out in the crowd, right? I have my own on the floor. Many of us are wearing scarves, right? And what is it about a scarf, right? And it can be used for medicinal reasons, right? Keep yourself warm. It can be used for religious reasons, to cover yourself up. And it can also be used for aesthetic reasons, right? We can see this both in the military, and if any of you go to football games, you know what color scarf you wear has very meaningful implications as well, right? And here he has chosen to use that iconic item of food to give those same ideas throughout. And I mentioned that Dali, right, likes bread. And if any of you have not had the fortune to go up to see his self-designed museum in Spain, it is a trip in and of itself. It is the most surreal of probably any building outside of the Sagrada Familia. And if you look very closely, all along the outside of the facade are in fact loaves of bread superimposed. Okay, all right. I realize we really haven't spoken about Spanish food yet, and it's 20 minutes in, and I promise to. But I want to make sure that we all have a common understanding of when I say cuisine, what I mean, right? And historians or scholars of food studies tend to use these four combinations as sort of defining principles, core and basic foods, right? We can see that clearly in the Velázquez painting, right? We have eggs, we have wine, we even have the olive oil. Flavor principles. These are going to be secondary ingredients that show up predominantly over and over and flavor food. Over in the right-hand corner, we have the onion, and then we have roasted red pepper, or what we might know as smoked paprika, much more commonly today. Tools and techniques. This clay pot, the olla, over a wood fire, and because of the lack of wood in Spain, boiling becomes a traditional method. You need a lot less wood or fuel than if you would be roasting, right? And then etiquettes and ways of eating. Again, how is it done? Well, we can see forks and bowls, etc., right? So think about that on this journey of how we are layering on these concepts over time. Because for my final metaphor, right, just as with artwork, that you start with empty and it is layer after layer after layer of paint that you arrive, so too is it with this idea of Spain and food, that you have to look over time, layer by layer of layer to arrive at the end product. Right. Is there such a thing as Spanish cuisine? Right? I was just talking to one of your audience members, and I asked her when she was last in Spain, and she said 1967. And I said, that is awesome, right? Because, of course, she was there during Franco regime, and really before you had a lot of the modern infrastructure of Spain, right? And a lot of people have argued there's no such thing as Spain, right? In particular, the Catalans, right, who just took that referendum. Yeah, right, we are not Spanish. We are Catalan, right? And you could also argue that there's no such thing as a national cuisine in most countries. Does the United States have a national cuisine? The best argument I've heard is fast food is our national cuisine, right? Does Italy have a national cuisine? Right? Would the North say they eat like the South? Right? France? China? India? Right? So largely, this notion that even a national cuisine exists is part of a larger discourse, and it's normally tied to when you have the ideas of nationalism, of when you want this loose group of people to unite under one political system and have a shared culture, that food becomes this political statement over and over. And that's going to happen in Spain much later than in other countries, right? But they knew it was an important distinction. They knew that it was an important tool in which to unify these people, right? And we can see this over and over. For example, going back to Italy, I don't know if any of you have heard of Mazzini, right? Big political guy, right? So we're talking unification 1860. And he said, we have created Italy, Now we must create Italians, right? And years later, you have the most important cookbook, right, that united Italy under one cookbook, right? First time that you see recipes from all of the regions within one cover, right? In Spain, it's going to happen at the end of the 19th century, right? And part of the reason, it's so very different, right? Up in Galicia, where you have sort of the Atlantic estuaries, right? Brackish waters, wonderful place to leave and go cod fishing. Up in the Basque region, you have the hilly, verdant countryside. Extremadura, talk about extreme, dry, desert-like, flat. The plains around Madrid, known for their sheep farming, right? Oh, goodness me. In the east, Valencia, we'll see we have all of these irrigated systems that allowed new products to thrive. Down by Cadiz, in the Mediterranean, right? The whole different water system from the north that it's going to allow different products to arrive. And then I'm not sure if any of you recognize this, in Almeria. This nickname is called the Sea of Plastic, because these are all plastic-covered greenhouses. This area of Spain gets an incredible amount of sunlight, but it also gets a huge amount of wind, so they need to cover all of these plates so the wind doesn't break the plants, right? And those are all greenhouses, and it's where you have the highest production of tomatoes and peppers in Spain, right? Okay. Layering on, if not from geography, we can also say historically. And it's the Phoenicians, right? The Phoenicians who are going to start laying the very first foundation. And in particular, right, even though they're located all the way here, they make their way to the bottom of the Iberian Peninsula. Not surprisingly, this becomes an incredibly important geographic location. Who controls this 20 kilometers? Controls the entire Mediterranean, right? And it also becomes the way in which you can see the tuna swimming into the Mediterranean and leaving the Mediterranean, right? And it becomes huge business for the Phoenicians, the harvesting of tuna, right? And they are the first to really develop a traditional system of tuna fishing that we'll see that's down in Barbate that still continues today, right? A little bit later, Roman settlement, Claudia, where you can still see the tanks where they kept the tuna until they were ready to use, where they salted it, right? And a delicacy, if any of you have had the pleasure of having it, moljama, which is a salted, dried tuna loin, where they cut it, they salt it, and then they actually bring it up onto the roof of the factories and let it just hang out in the sunlight, and it picks up all of the breeze and naturally dries. And it is an intense, intense flavor of tuna and salt. So I have two short clips for you to see of the traditional almendrada. And hopefully this will work. Did I mention I'm a Luddite? So there would be two giant towers, right, that would look down on the Mediterranean. And when you have the schools of tuna, it would become very dark and they would trail the fish coming in. And then they would send off the signal, and all of the men would go out in their fishing boats with really large nets and anchors. And this still goes on today.
A bordo de sus embarcaciones, acuden a la cita sobre las limpias aguas, donde calan sus anclas y sus redes, siguiendo antiguas y sabias costumbres que se remontan a la época fenicia. Allí es donde el atún, en su emigración periódica y legendaria a través del estrecho, encuentra una muerte 1000 veces repetida.
There would be 2 large seasons of the tuna fishing coming in and coming out of the Mediterranean. I think we have one more clip.
Una levantada.
And so once they set out the ships and let all of the nets fill in, the fish would swim into it, and then they very slowly start closing the circle of the fishing boats in the nets.
Que no pudieron huir antes,
and they're going to start closing in and pulling in the nets.
Lentamente se ha ido jalando la red, empujando
rather violently, you might say. They're going to start physically grabbing each fish and dragging them onto the boat. And the entire area in which this is done, the sea turns a bright red, right? A lot of the fishing, the tuna production, the factories are in that same area today, and they pride themselves. They've had to go out further and further as the number of tuna has declined. But today, southern Spain is still known for its canned tuna, high exclusive canned tuna. And I had the privilege of going and seeing a tuna, bluefin tuna, being broken down. And he was such an expert, he did it in less than 1 minute. It was amazing, and I apologize that I don't have that for you. In addition to the Phoenicians, of course, the next group that really are going to leave such an impact on Spanish foodways are the Romans. So we're talking about the Punic Wars coming in, setting up their empire, which they're excellent at, as many of you know, all throughout much of the Spanish peninsula. Infrastructure, incredibly important. We're talking about roads, bridges, clearing harbors, and all of that is because of administering for the empire, but also bringing back those raw materials, because if Rome was to survive, you needed to feed Rome. Aqueducts, able to irrigate. Cultivation becomes incredibly important, both with grapes, right? For wheat, and then the final one, olive oil. And if you're talking about one commodity that is tied to the Roman Empire in Spain, it is olives. Who's been to Rome? All right, lots of hands on that one. Have you been to Mount Testaccio? It's a little bit outside of the main drag of Rome, but it is the area in which all of the foods outside of Rome came into Rome, right? And this mountain, which you can see from a distance, right, it's so large that there are restaurants built into it, is entirely made up of shards of amphora from Spain, from olive oil that was brought in during this Roman Empire, right? I know, right? It's amazing. It's amazing. And it was cheaper to just break them than to clean them and send them back. So Spain and olive oil becomes big business from this time period to the present. It's still the largest producer of olive oil. 2 largest export markets might surprise you for Spanish olive oil: Portugal and Italy, right? And in much of the 20th century, there was a quite a controversy in that the Italians were taking the oil from Spain, bottling it, and putting on Italian olive oil. Yes, but most of you, if you were consuming olive oil from Spain pre-1980, you were actually consuming Spanish olive oil. Right? Today, it is still an incredibly popular ingredient to use in Spanish cuisine. You have the bread with tomato and olive oil, or pan pa tomate if you're speaking Catalan, fried fish. We have salted cod pil pil, which means it's poached in olive oil, and then that olive oil is emulsified and used as a sauce with garlic. Fried potatoes, yum, and then torta de aceite, and these are olive oil torts. 24% of it is olive oil. It's olive oil, flour, a little bit of sugar on top, and salt. You can get them at your grocery store, right? And I have been to the Inés Rosales factory, and let me just tell you, there are actually 8 women who are forming these by hand to this day. They've tried to industrialize it, and they say that the machine just doesn't give the same texture as the human hand. So for 8 hours a day, these ladies press out these tortillas, nothing but their hands. It is magic to watch. Right? From the Romans, we also get the first cookbook, Apicius. And I thought you might be interested in some dishes that carry through from that, right? Mind you, not all do. Apicius also mentions the very famous peacock recipe, right? Roasted peacock. I'm assuming nobody had that last Thursday. As well as, unless you took a trip down to Florida, the equally famous roasted flamingo. Right? No. Okay. How about these? Fig-fed pork liver. What they would do, right? These Romans, gluttonous. They would take pigs, they would starve them, and then they would let them go at it and eat as many dried figs as they wanted. All that work, all that dried food makes you thirsty. You would then give your pig as much mead as they wanted. The mead both reconstituted the figs in the pig, making the stomach both ferment and grow to the point it exploded from within, and then you would harvest that liver, cook it up with some pepper, thyme, and lovage. Right? I don't know if some of you are planning your next dinner party. I'm guessing that's what right? A harmless salad, right? Because eating raw lettuce would make you sick, according to the Romans. So after you ate this salad, this lettuce, these raw vegetables, you would then take a mixture of all of these ingredients and then drink it by the spoonful. What does it remind you of now? A vinaigrette or a salad dressing that we do to this day. Roast suckling pig, famous in Spain to this day, right? Where they will go, take a plate, turn it on the side, cut the pig with the side of the plate, break it to show that it is real, and then serve it to you. Sole with eggs, or any fish with scrambled eggs, quite famous. And then look at their sweet. In Spain, it is torrijas, but we probably would call it something else. Right? How different are we really, right? All right. With the Visigoths, right? So again, these layers of people. Very little changed, in fact, from the Romans. They were Christian, they weren't Catholic, but they became Catholic, and they carried on many of the same traditions that the Roman did. So they continued in farming. Wheat and meat still important, wine still important, right? But we could say with the domination of the Visigoths that Catholicism and Spanish becomes an even tighter connection, right? And look at what our friend Isidore said about Apicius, our Roman epicure, right? Who, by the way, did commit suicide, right? For whoever served greed and gluttony kills his body and soul. Right? Fasting, asceticism, this idea that in Spain, in all of Catholic Europe, that there are days that you can eat meat, dairy, fats, and the days that you are prohibited, right? The fasting days. Those fasting days, if you're a Catholic today, sorry, you are not hardcore. Hardcore meant the 40 days of Lent, all of the saints' days, the ember days, right? And the tax days as well, plus Fridays, all the year round, right? Okay. Up until now, much of Spanish food was very similar to the rest of Europe, but all of that changes in 711 with the Muslims, the Arabs, the Moors, whatever you want to call them, right? And it's not just, right? It is not just that they were there for 700 years, they left a mark. And it's an incredibly, what do I say, controversial topic to this day, right? So years ago, I was bringing a group of students to Spain for a 3-week food and wine tour. Awesome, right? And it was awesome. All right, so I, like many of you probably do, okay, I'm looking at what sites we're going to, but more importantly, where are we eating each day? And I was very excited. We were going to Cordoba for the first time. I had convinced them we need to go to Cordoba. They need to see the center of Islamic Spain, of Andalusia, right? And so we're going to go to the mosque. We're going to take a walking tour of the Jewish section of Cordoba. And then for lunch, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. And I thought to myself, okay, clearly, a Spanish all-you-can-eat buffet must be different than ye old country buffet here in the States, right? No, it was not. And I thought, my God, how am I going to explain this to my culinary students who really believe that they know everything there is to know about food? And so I wrote to our contact in Spain, Spanish man, and I said, why are we not going to a North African restaurant, which is surprisingly similar to medieval Islamic food, or at least a Sephardic restaurant? And I kid you not, people, in the email he responded to me, why would we do that? You're coming here to learn about Spanish food, right? So this legacy of the Muslims, right, of the Jews in Spain is still fraught with cultural landmines, I would say. But there's no denying their impact, just on language itself, right? And it's that bottom one that my students, I don't know if they're like you, that my students always land on, right? Alcohol, they introduced the technology of alcohol. They, of course, are using it for perfume. Europeans decide could be better served for something else, right? We also see a host of new technological changes that they bring in. The huerta that I talked about, they irrigated fields for the first time, right? Windmills, water wheels, right? And we can see all of this incorporation with new foodstuffs through the calendar of Cordoba, which was an agricultural treatise coming out of this same time period. New crops that are cultivated in Europe for the first time, not just in Spain, southern Italy, southern France as well. Durum wheat, the wheat that you use to make pasta, right? Bitter oranges and lemons, eggplants, spinach. In my mind, probably the most important food crop when you're talking about geopolitics, sugarcane, right? Rice and saffron. most iconic of dishes, paella, the two ingredients, right? And we can see with tools and techniques, right, that olla is attributed to the Muslims. Preserving fish in vinegar, right? Torrón, nuts in a nougat, right? With that sugar cane, all are going to be introduced and remain to this day. And if we're to look at the influence of the Sephardic community, right? The adafina, right? Sabbath stew, can't cook from sundown Friday to Saturday. Make a stew, let it just simmer in those embers. Becomes the cocida, famous dish around Madrid, one pot of noodles, chickpeas, broth, meat, cabbage. It's delicious, right? As well as the roast suckling lamb that you can still find in the north, and alcachofas or artichokes. Right? Even gazpacho has its legacy in either Arab or a Jewish dish, right? Now we think of gazpacho as this today, right? Tomatoes, red peppers. That wasn't in Europe until 1492. So gazpacho was actually made up of almonds, grapes, and cucumbers and garlic, right? Culturally, the Spanish can look to Zuryab. He was the tastemaker of Islamic Spain, Persian loudest, right? And he came in, brought his Spanish lute, which became the Spanish guitar, brought his music that became a dance that became mixed with the Roma, flamenco. But he also said, you know, at court we should do things differently. We should divide food up into 3 courses, right? And they should end with the sweets. That was new. Before it was all served together. He said we should use tablecloths, napkins, and we should also start using glassware to drink from. Much better tasting than metal, right? And these grand banquets became the talk of the town as a sign of Andalusian predominance in the Islamic world, right? Trying to set up that caliphate, the Umayyads, to contest the power of the Abbasids back on the Arabian Peninsula, right? Has anybody made a turducken? I know this seems totally random. Anyone, turducken. Does anyone not know what a turducken is? I think I saw one hand up. So very quickly, a turducken is a turkey that is stuffed with a duck that is stuffed with a chicken, right? All right. And kudos if you've done that. I have not tried it, right? But the Arab banquet chefs would say, oh, please, nothing, right? Because what they would do is take a sheep, take out its innards, stuff that with your goose, with your duck, with your chicken, with your songbird, coated in spices, roasted in the oven, and then take a cow and take that out and stuff the entire sheep into the cow. And they said, that, people, is how you impress. That is how you impress, right? Right? All right. Recipe cookbook, right? The cookbook that we can look to from roughly 1350, Catalan, right? One of the first books printed in Catalan was the Saint Sauvé, and this has a recipe in vinegar sauce that is very similar to the escabeche that you can find today, right? So, all right. Everything changes in 1492 for 2 reasons, as you all know. One, the Reconquest, right? This is when we're able to take that pomegranate, that granada, and add it to the Spanish crest, right? When Isabel and Ferdinand take over the city, right? But we can also add the Columbian exchange, meaning the discovery of the Americas, with the motto plus ultra, more beyond, more beyond. All right. If we're talking reconquest, we're talking jamón, people. Jamón. We can just say it in one word. But of course, I'll add. Right? And we know we have trial records from the inquisitors. Right? Because, of course, you had two choices as a Muslim or a Jew. You could convert, or you could get the heck out of town. Right? Frequently chose to convert. Right? So the conversos, the moriscos, right? But were they really converting, or were they just practicing in private? Inquisitors only had to do one thing. Who would like a piece of jamón? Who will eat the jamón? Who will eat the jamón, right? And it becomes this pig becomes the symbol of Spain. Richard Ford, going back to him, says, it is the duty of a pig, Spanish pig, to get as fat as he can, as big as he can, and then die for his country, right? Right? And they certainly like their jamón, they still do. Jamón serrano simply means coming from the Celtic pig. Jamón iberico comes from the Iberian, the black-footed strain of pigs. Bellota, finished on acorns, and then more recently, they found another pig that suits their jamón needs, and that is a heritage breed from Hungary called the Mangalista pig, which is, in fact, a pig in sheep's clothing. Okay. All right, Columbian Exchange. This was coined by Alfred Crosby in 1972, right? Alfred Crosby, geographic historian from Massachusetts, and he goes on to title this most important event, which is the transfer of flora and fauna between Europe and the Americas. And you can see, right, how incredibly diverse this is going to make both sides of the Atlantic with regard to food, both before and after, right? Certainly the tomato, I think the potato, and the peppers, if we're talking Spanish food, are going to be the most influential, as well as chocolate, right? As well as chocolate. Right. You can see when it starts showing up in paintings. But what I would like to say is that these products, for the most part, were not readily adopted into Spanish culture. Potatoes and corn, not fit for human consumption. That was really animal fodder. It was only in times of famine that you would start eating those. Tomatoes and eggplant, nightshade, oh, botanicals, pretty. Let's grow them in a greenhouse and look at them as curiosity. Right? But it is chocolate that I want to pause at, right? Because I think it has such a fascinating story, right? So Columbus, first guy to come across chocolate, cacao, when he sees it spilling out in canoes and says, it must be something important. Cortez, the second European, right? And he sees this when he's at the court of Montezuma, right? And there he notices Montezuma is given several pots of chocolate before he goes to visit his wives. So, I don't even know if I should go there, but why not? You don't actually need Viagra, okay? Chocolate will serve the purpose, right? And chocolate, for this reason in part, right, was believed to stir up the passions. And the church thought, I don't know if that passion stirring is not what we're in the business of, right? Not so much, not so much. And so they actually want to ban it, right? Spanish crown, we're making an awful lot of money taxing it. So we're kind of good. The church, I'm not sure. It seems rather dangerous. The other problem for the Catholics was, is chocolate a food or is it a beverage? Because it was only consumed in liquid form. right? But it also had added to it ground bread, ground nuts, and if any of you have had churros con chocolate, you know that is thick, right? Catholic, there's no eating between midnight and communion, but you can drink to allay thirst. I kid you not, people. We have the highest theologians in Europe who are writing back and forth, is chocolate a beverage? Is chocolate a food? This is what they were concerned with because it had such moral implications, right? And in the end, they leave themselves open. And when you go to Spain, you do not say, I'm going to eat chocolate or I'm going to drink chocolate. You simply say, I'm going to tomar chocolate. I'm going to take chocolate. Right? I think Quevedo, right, social critic, does such a fantastic job of understanding culture, right? And these are from his Dreams and Visions. There came the devil of tobacco and the devil of chocolate, and they did more to avenge the Indians against us than our disease and our guns. So we went as Europeans and took out 28.5 million Native Americans through disease and guns. But in the end, whose culture won? Tobacco and chocolate. In the 16th and 17th century, right, with all of this influx of wealth into Europe, we also have a decided fall from grace in Europe. Right? And that goes back to a lot of older social and cultural and political practices. Lothario de Torme, Goya, right? What's he doing? Some people apparently used to think that that was a doctor. No, we all know. He's looking for the smell of sausage. Has Lothario stolen a sausage and eaten it? Right? Because the story, if you're unfamiliar with Lothario de Torme, a Picaro novel, Living by One's Wits, is about a young boy who went to live with 3 different masters, a blind man, a priest, and an aristocrat. And all Lothario had to do was try and find food for all of them. And what it did was it spoke to the inability of Spain to feed herself. Right? So as I like to say, right, even when Spain could have a very good meal, she could rarely digest it. Don Quixote, too, ripe with food metaphor. Right? If you read Don Quixote, what's fascinating is he will often sit down to a table at a meal, but he never actually eats. Sancho Panza, fat belly, on the other hand, is always looking for his next meal. Right? And that leads us to the 19th century. The 19th century is a pivotal time for Spanish history, right? In part because of the Napoleonic Wars, right? When we have the ultimate fall of grace from Spain and France invades, we have this idea of gastronomy whereby food should be considered on an intellectual level and it should be judged and compared to each other. And we have the birth of nationalism, of national pride, that you see yourself as distinctly different from other countries, and food, as I mentioned, is a part of that, right? This is when we have those English and American writers, for instance, who say Spain. It is a hungry, thirsty, beerless, beefless, tealess land. Yes, right? Or Spain. Its very name means destitution. Right? Where's Spain? Any good cook must be able to make something out of nothing, right? By the end of the 19th century, however, we do start seeing the rise of Spanish nationalism tied to the idea of liberal constitution. And we have two cookbooks that attempt to use food for this national identity. The dish that one chooses for that national dish, olla podrida, right? Spoiled stew or powerful stew. The choice is still yours, right? And very much we can see how this hearty food coming from Burgos up in the north attempts to bring all of these legacies together. We have the blood sausage, we have carrot, and we certainly have a lot of pork and beans being brought in, right? This becomes tied to a time when that regional identity is still very evident, right? And if we're talking about post-Civil War, right, 1930s, that's going to happen in three distinct ways, right? So Spain is still broke, right? Has no money. Civil War, right? Cultural norm of the tapas. When we go out to tapas, we frequently think, it means going out and having a bunch of small plates. In Spain, very different. In Spain, you go to one place and have one tapa, and then go down to the next bar, have another, and each time you take turns, of course, of who's buying it, right? How does this culturally resonate? Well, one, it was a time when Spanish households had very little to offer. So by going out, it allowed you to meet your friends out in public, and each person took place as the host, right? When you go to tapas in Spain, although this is changing, one thing that you will very quickly see is it's infrequently vegetables and it's infrequently chicken. And that's because these are both seen as poor food. That's what you eat at home when nobody else is looking. You eat the pork products out in public where everybody can see you and pretend that you're part of this wealthier society than you are, right? And tapas is started in the South. As you know, tapa, tapar, to cover. Two different understandings. One, little piece of ham or a piece of bread to put over your glass so flies don't fly in. Or it was to give a piece of particularly strong blue cheese to wine merchants just before they tasted your wine. To cover up let's just say it was no French wine. All right. In the North, we can also say that eating has taken on two really regional characteristics, and one is through the gastronomic clubs of the North. And I think we have a video. I was going to say, if not, I'm very good at interpretive dance.
Everything about San Sebastian is spectacular. The harbour setting, the people, the ambience, but above all, a magical addiction to food. There aren't a lot of Basque cookbooks. No one here seems to need them. Chefs come from around the world to learn the secrets. But if they hung around the back streets, they might just pick it all up for free. Paxi Balandia may seem a little demanding, but food is a serious subject in these parts, and the pressure is on. For half of you, this door normally marks the end of the tour. For this is a closed world, a testosterone-fired society where all have one thing in common: they're not women. In 2 hours, Paxi must produce a gastronomic sensation for his closest friends.
Y ahora una cebollita, vamos a poner. Vale. Esto todo así. Venga, esto todo así.
Worried I'm going to chop my hand off there. That's a hand of it too. It's more like a massacre than a meal, I think, but I'm just learning. If I was Basque, I'd have been born with gastronomy in the genes. Because here in San Sebastian, if you're male and you can't cook, it's a social handicap that will blight your life forever. Now, all this is no idle pursuit. In fact, one Basque friend of mine put it, sex is great, but food around here is a total obsession.
¿Aquí el chorizo no echas para adentro?
No, nunca. Quitarle bien la grasa y luego le pondrás al final.
Ahora esto hay que echarlo. No le echas un poco de grasa de esa. Ahora ¿qué estamos de médicos?
Cuando lo tenga hecho, le pongo aquí ahora ese.
No sé si estoy muy de acuerdo.
Debate over cooking technique is lubricated with some juicy blood sausages and washed down with more than a drop of the local brew.
That's the wine called chocolate.
Una vez que se hizo, bueno, una vez no, habitualmente se hacen concursos de cocineros de sociedades y las sociedades sí que están orgullosas de ser las que mejor cocina y por lo tanto dentro de la sociedad sí que se busca a la gente que cocina mejor y que se quiere presentar en el concurso.
For the last century, the gastronomy clubs, dozens of them, have flourished. Evidence of memorable meals and mates past festoon the walls.
Happy days.
This is a moment of celebration, a great gorging with your friends, some fabulous Spanish red, and she who must be obeyed doesn't have to be obeyed at all, for the moment at least.
Everybody here can be loved, to drink, to chant, well, however they want. But if there are ladies, always they make a stop. No, what do you do that? What do you say to your friend or your neighbor? Can you do that? No, and this is make big difference.
So boys can be boys, and from what I gather, the girls don't mind the time off either, at least most of them. Did I say there were no women allowed?
Y bueno, y la mujer, pues entonces, ¿qué ha hecho? La mujer normalmente se junta en las cafeterías a merendar con sus amigas y al cotilleo, igual que los hombres. Lo que pasa es que es distinto local. Las mujeres lo hacen en las cafeterías a las tardes y los hombres lo hacen aquí en la sociedad. Pero más o menos, yo creo que en el País Vasco siempre ha sido como muy liberales las mujeres en ese aspecto.
Alejado de ti, Puerto Rico del alma. Adiós, 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 Virgen querida, tierra de mi adiós, 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 adiós.
In case you think it'll soon be adios to these bastions of blokery, the club's waiting lists have never been longer. As the night winds up, the wider world, complete with wives, will soon reclaim its men. But until then, 100 years of tradition is proudly and loudly proclaimed.
En mi viejo
The second video that I want to show you with regard to eating patterns is in the cider houses, also in the Basque region. This one is shorter.
One of the most curious and fun experiences you can find in the Basque country begins with the cry of Chonch, the cider ritual. Each year, towards mid-January, some well-known character is made to officially open the cider season. From then on, it's all about serving yourself glasses of cider straight out of the barrel, and find yourself immersed in one of the most deeply rooted Basque traditions. In Euskadi, the ritual and culture of the Chonch can be experienced in many different ways. You can see how cider is made while you learn how to differentiate the different types of apple. Or discover the past, present and future of the cider with a visit to a cider house. A true museum located at the foot of the apple orchard in the Guipuzcoan town of Astigarraga, and where by means of cutting-edge technology you will learn the secrets of cider. But without a doubt, once you have immersed yourself in the cider culture, the best way to taste it is by going to a cider house. You will find them scattered across the Basque country, although most of them are in Gipuzkoa. Enjoy a typical cider house menu, made up of cod omelette, fried cod with green peppers, grilled T-bone steak, and for dessert, cheese and quince and nuts. And all this in the friendliest and family-like of atmospheres. It's precisely the great mood that reigns in the cider houses what characterizes the Chonch ritual. It's quite common to end lunch or dinner standing up and speaking to other diners while the landlord opens the barrels so that the patrons can fill their glasses.
So the word choch means open the tap. And if you're at the cider house, at any time you can stand up and just say, choch! And then everybody gets up and follows you over to these big barrels of cider, and they open the tap, and you grab your own, right? And this tap is about here, and so it's coming streaming up, and you have to be very careful and catch it in your glass as you get it. And when I said, right, that your dish is cod omelet, cod, T-bone steak, let me just be clear. You're not getting a plate of this. It's one plate per table. And everybody just helps themselves off the same plate. So it's incredibly a communal experience. Okay. Okay. Well, where are we today in Spain, right? The resurgence of Spain as a global dominance, if not politically, we can certainly say gastronomically, and it has to do with really this one guy here, Ferran Adrià, the most famous of Spanish chefs from the Catalan region, and I think that is not by mistake, right? His restaurant is closed now. He's in fact turning it into an art museum, right? But his colleagues have 3 out of the 10 top restaurants, not in Europe, but in the world, right? And I think it is because of Spain's history under Franco, where you had incredibly suppression, looked to tradition, tried to suppress regional identity, that when that mantle was lifted in 76, you had such an incredible outpouring of creativity, and that went not just to the arts, but to food as well, right? So you can still see we have the soul here with all of those ingredients, regional, right? Red garden fruits with edible beet bubbles, and then the smoked tuna again with fresh figs and pine nuts, and hopefully no exploding pigs were used in that one, right? And it is because I like to convey Ferran Adrià as an artist that it's so fitting, in that he is a postmodern deconstructionist. He breaks down food into their atomic level and then reconfigures them. And he uses new techniques such as foam, spheres, that you'll see a video on, and liquid nitrogen. So I have one final video.
had dinner here last night, and
This
the
is
first
Mark
thing that
Bittman
came
of
to
the New
table
York
was
Times.
an olive. And frankly, I was disappointed. I thought, what? Ferran has now discovered the best olive in the world? I took a bite. My mind was blown. I abandoned all hope of thought. Just decided to enjoy myself and then find out today what was going on. So now Ferran is going to show us the new spherical olive.
Pero lo primero que tenemos que tener es unas muy buenas olivas.
Mark, this may seem obvious, but first you need to have a very, very good olive.
A good olive.
And this is what we have right here. Every season, they kind of do a tasting of 10, 12 olives to decide which one is better. But they don't taste the whole olive. They taste the juice, because not the best olive when you eat it whole may be the best one to do this dish. It needs to be the best juice. So they make this kind of a puree.
Okay. Puree of
And
olives.
it's strained.
La esferificación invertida, como le expliquemos, es que un producto que tiene calcio actuará sobre agua con alginato.
Any product, any liquid like this one that has calcium, the salt of calcium, will react when you introduce that same liquid in another liquid that have alginate.
Alginate, yes. But olives have natural calcium in them, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So any food that has natural calcium in it, you put it in a solution of alginate?
Okay.
And you will achieve
And
it.
alginate is
All
a
natural
derivative
ingredients.
of seaweed.
And look what happened.
So it forms a skin
If you leave
around the
this
puree.
for too long, 3-4 minutes, it's gonna be way too thick.
It becomes thick?
Unos 3 minutos. Realmente se deja 3 minutos.
2 or 3 minutes is the time you want in the water.
Y después se pone en aceite, ajo, limón, naranja, ¿ok? Y se deja de un día para otro.
And then what he does is recreating the same environment that we serve the traditional olives in the tapas bars.
Yeah, this is great because it
the
looks
garlic,
like...
it's the orange, it's the olive oil, and he puts them there like for 24 hours to marinate. Take a look at this, because this is the magical moment.
Yeah.
Wow. Because imagine the same when you put it in your mouth.
I have experienced it. It's incredible. Look at this. It's translucent. The skin is translucent.
Y esta tiene menos tiempo.
This one is less time.
Unbelievable.
Even more liquid.
And when you put this in your mouth, it's like this explosion.
This one we have to eat, Jose. Tell Ferran.
Que se lo puede probar este.
Sí, sí.
Are you sure you're ready for this? Well, you tasted before, but not with the master looking.
Right.
Don't get nervous.
Amazing. Just amazing. An olive made out of an olive. This is art imitating life. Ferran, thank you for this one.
Tiene que continuar la fiesta.
The party is gonna keep going on.
I know, right? And Ferran Adrià, I think if you were to summarize his philosophy in one phrase, it is to him, creativity means not copying, right? Creativity means not copying. But that doesn't mean forgetting, right? So when I asked that same woman who was in Spain in 1967, she says, I remember the tortilla, right? I remember the tortilla. This is Ferran Adrià's tortilla, right? And I will leave you with one final image. Because what is this? This is caviar, right, of melon in a consommé of ham. So when you taste it, you are reminded of that other classic jamón and melon, right? So the persistence of time, the persistence of memory. Food and art. Food as art. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. I do ask that those of you who are getting up to leave, please do so quietly. And if you have a question, we'll bring the mic to you.
you for an interesting talk. I was really glad you showed the confradías in the Basque Country. They're very unique. The question I had is, when I was in Spain and I said, well, I want to just sort of dabble in Spanish cooking, I was recommended the Joy of Cooking of Spanish Cuisine, which is Simon Ortega's 1,080 Recipes. Mm-hmm. Where do you place that book? Is that a traditionalist Franco style, or is it what?
El Practico? The
no,
big red
it's
book?
Simon Ortega's 1,080 Recipes,
right,
which is fairly new, but I'm not sure if it's considered. It's more traditional, but is it Franco style, or is it getting a little more modern?
I mean, I think it's hard to decide when you're saying more modern, what you mean by more modern in a sense. I think, are you talking about new ingredients or are you talking about new technique, right? And in that way, I think it bridges very much so, the old and the new. But I think, you know, even if you were to talk to Ferran Adrià, you can see that he's bridging the old and the new. So it's that whole spectrum of where you find. I think probably the most famous 20th century is a book called El Practico, which is the big red book, which is the equivalent to Escoffier's book, which attempts to codify Spanish. But that was actually written by an Argentinian man. So I didn't talk about it. So absolutely, I think that's a great book. Mm-hmm. Oh, the other Goya. I simply meant because Goya, the food product line, is by a Spanish family who immigrate to Cuba and then to New York City and start importing Spanish food. So that was from Goya to Goya. So apparently it's a good reason that it was not called that by the title.
Could you comment?
Sorry.
Could you comment on the role of Penelope Casas in popularizing Spanish food?
Sure. I think she has done almost the equivalent to Julia Child popularizing French food in America, Marcella Hazan, as well. In that she is very much cooking for the bourgeois, so she's cooking for the middle class housewife, right? And so it is elevated food, but simple enough for the home cook to do. So I think she is part of that incredibly underappreciated group of cookbook authors that we've seen in the country. And I think her book is probably the most well-known in the United States, at least historically. Claudia Rodin, more recently, I think her book on the food of Spain is fantastic.
Thank you, that was great. I wanted to ask you, with the downturn of the Spanish economy in the last few years, what did that do to the eating cultures, whether eating out or eating in?
Great question. Unemployment, if you are under the age of 25, I believe is 50% still. Yeah, it's hard to say how much is the economy and how much is modernization and globalization. I'm still seeing a lot more prepared food, industrial-made food, and chains entering Europe. That being said, you have an incredibly wealthy set of high-end restaurants, so I would almost say that they're going on an awful lot of tourist dollars. And how much did the 1% suffer here? They can still afford to go out to eat, and I would say the same thing in Spain. So that upper echelon, still fine, right? Fast food, still fine. It's the middle family restaurant, the taberna, that tends to suffer more so. But, you know, the traditional idea of going out to eat in Spain is very different than ours, right? You would go out for tapas, for some snacks, and then go home for dinner. Right? When we go out for tapas, that is dinner, right? So I think even if you have very little money, you can still go and participate on a smaller level. And of course, wine is €1 for a glass if you're smart on where you're going, away from the tourists. And if you're in the South, which was historically the best part about going to the South, when you ordered a glass of wine, you got free tapas with it. So when I was traveling on $6 a day, I was living in the South and buying my dinner through drinks and getting the food with it. There are no college students. I can share my secrets.
I think you probably just answered my question, but I was curious about why there was such a divide between the haute cuisine and what you can find, walking around Spain. It just didn't seem like they had the sort of high, mid-range restaurants that you see so popular.
Would you
in
say
America.
that's any different than in America?
Yes, like if you walk around Boston, I think you find a lot of not fine dining, but just sort of under fine dining, and that's sort of throughout the United States, that's sort of become the standard. The sort of higher end, but not haute cuisine. And I'm wondering why you don't see that as much.
Well, I think I see the family taberna
Uh-huh.
and then the upper. So depending on the taberna that you're going to, right? Maybe that's what you mean, that there's...
It just didn't seem like there was as much creativity in the day-to-day cuisine as in comparison to the sort of high-end,
I would agree.
outrageous.
If you're not talking haute cuisine, you're talking about fairly traditional food. And I can tell you as well, after spending 3 weeks traveling and eating Spanish food, you are, and I feel bad saying this, begging for something else, right? And restaurants. And that is because you're having the same dishes. You're having an awful lot of cod, salted cod, right? You guys, I'm sure, recognize this. You're having an awful lot of jamón, just plate after plate after plate of cured meat. And you are begging for a salad, fresh vegetables. You have a little bit of pisto manchego, sort of stewed vegetables, right? But you're often looking. And even if you're drinking the water, if you look at the salt content of the bottled water in Spain, it has very high sodium, so you are always thirsty.
And one more question that's kind of related. How come you don't see international cuisine so much? You don't see so many international wines, so many, you don't see an Italian restaurant, for example, in Spain.
The question, I think that it's fairly insular. I think in part because up until 1976, Spain was closed. Right? So you didn't have that international cosmopolitanness of it. I mean, it was really fairly isolated from the rest of Europe because of Franco. I think that's part of it. I think if you're also talking about people in Spain, at least a lot of ones that I have, yeah, they like going out for that little bit of different food, but they really like their food, right? If you look at immigration patterns, 50% unemployment. Are you moving to Spain? No, right? So when you don't have the immigration groups, you don't have them bringing their food and foodways with them as well. And I also think if you go to France, if you go to Italy, that I've done a fair amount of traveling in, unless you are talking the very big cities, right? There are very few international restaurants. You're eating the food of the people. It just so happens in America, what do we value? Diversity. We call ourselves the melting pot. And with that, all of our people brought our own foodways, and in part that's why we are so much more diversified than more traditional cultures.
Thank you very much.
Go get lunch, people. Thank you.